Okay, everybody. Well, welcome. It's nice to join with you this afternoon for this very, very special program that we are calling From a Black Tevya to an Asian Willy Loman, When Modern Jewish Theater Calls Us to Confront American Racism and Bigotry. A nice light little title there for a very important discussion that we're having today. And we are incredibly honored that we are joined with Adam Immerwahr, who is the artistic director of Theater J, the nation's largest and most prominent Jewish theater. Having served in that role since 2015, he has also served as the associate artistic director of Tony Award-winning McCarter Theater in Princeton, New Jersey, and the resident director of Passage Theater in Trenton, New Jersey. Adam served on the producing team of multiple productions that have transferred to Broadway and off-Broadway, including the world premiere of Christopher Durang's Vanya and Sonia and Masha and Spike, which won the Tony Award for Best Play. As a director, his work has been seen across the world, from Aspen to Zimbabwe. He has directed off-Broadway and at many of the nation's premier regional theaters, such as McCarter Theater, Walnut Street Theater, Cleveland Playhouse, and others. He is the recipient of both the New Jersey Theater Alliance Applause Award and the Fairleigh Dickinson University Center for Nonprofits Emerging Nonprofit Leader Award. So Adam, it is an honor to be here with you to have our conversation today. So I'm going to just start off by asking you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe how you got interested in Jewish theater in particular in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me here. I so appreciate a chance to speak to this group.
Sure.
I got started in theater because I actually grew up in the theater. My mother is a theater maker who does theater for social change. My father's best friend at the university he worked at was the head of the theater program. So whenever any of them needed a kid in the show, I was in the show. Sort of one of those people who grew up inhaling the stage dust, as Paula Vogel says, and quickly getting addicted to it. But I didn't really have a background in Jewish theater to speak of. I had been, I directed a few Jewish plays in my career. The first one was called The Secret Life of Gefilte Fish, if you can believe it or not.
Sounds Jewish to me.
It was pretty Jewish. And, but it wasn't a particular interest of mine or focus of mine until the search for Ari Roth's replacement at Theater J began. And I was approached by a search consultant and I said, I have no interest in that whatsoever. Thank you very much. And they said, will you have a conversation? I said, well, a conversation I'll have, yeah, sure. In the course of talking about the job, I started to sort of think about what Jewish theater could be and what it would mean to be a theater like Theater J in the nation's capital as the nation's largest and most prominent Jewish theater. And you know, when you do one of these artistic director searches, the last step is you come down and you present some sort of sample seasons. And at this point, I still didn't think I wanted the job, but I thought, oh, well, you know, disloyalty is always rewarded. Let's see what happens. So I started preparing some sample seasons, and then I got really into it. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting, how you can speak to Judaism in all these different ways and speak to Jewishness in all these different ways and you know, sort of create a large tent as you're doing it. And I sort of talked myself into the job. And then I had to really work for it because then I really wanted it. So that was how I ended up in and now here I am. I'm on the board of the Alliance for Jewish Theater. It's like it's all I do, but it was certainly a turn for me in my career.
So now, how many years has it been now that since you've been at Theater J?
It's been 4 and change.
4 and change already. It's amazing. Well, you have done such remarkable work as someone who has attended many of the theater productions that have been under your watch. Truly remarkable stuff, and just the highest quality theater. And Washington, D.C. and the area is really, really blessed to have you. So I guess in those 4 and change years, you've also had quite an education in Jewish theater and what that expression really means. Actually, maybe some of us aren't even sure what we mean when we say Jewish theater. Can you help us define that a little bit?
Yeah, this is the perpetual conversation. I actually recently was on a conference call for the Alliance for Jewish Theater, and we're preparing a conference. And I said, I'll only participate if there's no sessions on what is Jewish theater. Like it goes on for weeks. It's what is Jewish is the most complicated.
And here you find yourself again.
And here I find myself again. So when I arrived at Theater J, there were a few things that were being used to define what was Jewish theater. Certainly plays that explicitly wrestled with Judaism or grappled with it, but Theater J was in a process of expanding its programming in an attempt to diversify its audience. And the argument was, if we can diversify the programming, we will diversify the audience. And I presumed that they meant racially in that phrasing. Though certainly there's lots of ways to diversify an audience. And when I arrived, I said, well, that's an interesting proposition. There's some logic here that we should cover, like, have you run out of more Jews to reach with your theater? Or have you determined that it's easier to reach more of these non-Jewish groups than it is to tap into more Jews who, by the way, disproportionately attend theater? In the Washington, D.C. area, we know this, is Jews attend theater at a far higher rate than non-Jews. And Theater J's audience, in fact, has been fairly consistently 60% Jewish and 40% non-Jewish, which is probably about the same ratio as the Folger Theater.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the background. And they were doing some plays. And when I arrived, I would sometimes watch one of these plays and go, this play is amazing and wonderful. It's about LGBT experience, about healthcare in America. It's about Lebanese American experience, about everything except for Judaism. So I got rather confused. There are something like 90 professional theaters in the DC metropolitan region. So very quickly, I decided that Theater J really needed to focus on plays that are what I would call legibly Jewish. Someone called them kosher Jewish plays, which I thought was sort of cute. Where I would say plays that in which Jewishness or Judaism is so intricately woven into the fabric of the play that if you removed it, the play would fall apart. Doesn't have to be central, but has to be a part of it. And I'm interested in plays that do that in all sorts of different ways, that wrestle with Judaism, that celebrate Judaism, that explore it, that explore history, culture, identity, that hit it from as many different angles as possible. The one exception that I make in the programming at Theater J, I guess there are sort of two. One is I feel that theater from Israel is Jewish theater. So we don't actually do a lot of it right now, but we're constantly looking at it. And my criteria for what makes a Jewish play, if it's from Israel, that's fine. Mm-hmm. And then the other is that occasionally we will do plays that are thematically very connected to the religious experience of Jews that can be very easy to create analogies back to the Jewish experience. So years ago, we did a play called The Christians, which was about a non-denominational church that is divided over a disagreement in interpretation of scripture, which is like how my synagogue got divided growing up. So it felt very Jewish to me. Mm-hmm. There's another play that I'm in love with called The Cake, which is about a lesbian couple going to the South, Alabama or Georgia or something like that, to get married back in one of their towns they grew up with. They were a mixed race couple, and they want to buy a wedding cake from one of the women's mother's best friend, and she is torn about whether she can sell them a cake and her own religious feelings as a evangelical Christian. And that, of course, to me feels like it is so similar to so many of the conversations that Jewish congregations have had over the last 10 years. So that it informs our understanding of the Jewish experience by seeing that kind of play. But all of these, the interesting thing about a Jewish theater is every play is about something. Every play is both particular and universal if it's any good. So I go to studio theater and I see an Irish play and I have all sorts of meaningful things that I take away from it. And so I feel that the same must be true. We must do plays that are really powerful and good. And whoever you are, if you see them, you go, oh, it's about Jews. And also it's about love or identity or family or, any of the other things that plays grapple with.
You really strike a chord in something that I like to teach, that what you're saying about Jewish theater is that it's essentially Jewish when it really can occupy multiple realms simultaneously, when it kind of inhabits a cognitive dissonance. To be Jewish, I often teach, is to live with one foot in kind of mainstream history and one foot out in some other place, some historic or timeless place. And it sounds to me like that's what you're expressing about Jewish theater, that it somehow weaves together these different dimensions of Jewishness in some combination or in some form. Although I don't, not to get into the weeds a little too much, but I've been to theater in Israel where there's yes, it's by Israelis with Israelis, and that's it. There's no doesn't have that dimension of two worlds at all. And I'm wondering, to just ask it, like, if it's Israeli, it's automatically Jewish. Is that always? It's not necessarily always true, is it?
It's certainly not always true, but I do think that as a Jewish theater in the nation's capital, presenting Israeli work is in and of itself a sort of Jewish action to take, though I totally agree with you. One of the things that's so interesting about American Jewish theater, and I learned this when I started reading the Yiddish plays, which we can talk about in a moment, is that there's basically no plays about American Jews or that deal with Judaism written in America that don't in some ways deal with Jews as outsiders, as the other, as a minority, as an oppressed group, or as people who are grappling with generational trauma in some way or another having to do with Jewish history. And so that, when that thought struck me, the first thing I thought was like, well, what about Fiddler on the Roof? Well, of course, Fiddler on the Roof, the Russians come in and beat up everyone at the wedding, right? There's always this sense of where this separate group, and of course that doesn't apply just to Jews, which is part of what makes it all universal. And frankly, part of what I think has made Jewish theater even more vital in the last few years, as we've looked at our history of oppression and outsiderness, otherness, immigration, and found ways to apply it to the current political moment. But interestingly, in both the Israeli theater and the Yiddish theater, you don't always have that. In an all-Jewish culture, like the Yiddish theater was written in, effectively, the Lower East Side of New York, you could know no one who was not a Jew if you chose to. People wrote plays that were about, like money and lotteries and prostitutes and all sorts of things, just as they do in Israel, that never imagine, the Russians coming in and beating you up at your wedding. So that's a really interesting distinction between, I would say, American Jewish theater, which is most of what we do, and some of these other pieces of theater that I think are Jewish. I mean, I think a play from the Yiddish theater where everyone just assumes they're Jewish and no one mentions it, that's Jewish to me because of where it comes from.
It reminds me of I haven't seen it, even though I should have. The television show Shtisel apparently is this show about Haredi Jews, but they're having absolutely normal plot twists that and so in the same way, it's an entirely Jewish environment, and then suddenly those issues which are so definitional or defining in American Jewish theater aren't necessarily there. So just out of curiosity, maybe could you name perhaps a couple of pieces that you would think of as sort of the greatest examples of this American Jewish theater? And perhaps also, are there hidden gems that you think that are remarkable that maybe we're not as aware of, that also lift up this particular tension that we're talking about?
Yeah, so looking at Theater J's recent history, one of my favorite plays for dealing with this was Arthur Miller's Broken Glass. And every play we do, and this is actually going to tie us right back to the title of this conversation, every play at Theater J that we do, we always ask the question, can this play be cast multiculturally, and what would that do to the world of the play? And Arthur Miller's Broken Glass is about, it's a 1930s setting about a set of American Jews, a family, and what they're going through as they experience hearing news of the Holocaust. And so maybe it's later, late 30s, early 40s. So that's the setting of the play. So we did a reading of it with a multicultural cast, and it was really great, and they were wonderful. But you realize there were lines that Arthur Miller had written where you'll have a character saying, "I look in the mirror and I see my Jewish face," and it occurred to me after really studying the play that Arthur Miller was positing Judaism as a race, that it was an ethnicity that you could see on your face, that it was on your skin, that people saw it when you walked down the street. And that was so central to his idea of the Jew as the other, the outsider, in this remarkable psychological play. So that would be a great example of one of, I think, a perfect example of one of these sort of American Jewish plays. And the number of forgotten gems is just enormous. I mean, first of all, there's the entire canon of the Yiddish theater, of which Americans are exposed to only 3 plays, if that: The Golem, The Dybbuk, and God of Vengeance, which is referenced in Paula Vogel's brilliant play Indecent, which I'm sure many saw at Arena Stage. And beyond that, there's tens of thousands of plays that were written that nobody has performed, nobody has access to. So in a flawed production of it, it wasn't perfect. We did a play called Mirla Ephros, which is, we called it the Jewish Queen Lear. That's what people used to call it. It was one of the great classics of the Yiddish theater. There used to be multiple competing productions on the Lower East Side. It's a sort of Lear story about a wonderful Jewish matriarch. And it had never been done in English before. It's done in, when I tell my Israeli friends about it, they're like, Mirla Efrat, yeah, I saw it with so-and-so, you know, this diva, that diva, who's your diva? But in America, or Canada, it had never been, in England, it had never been done in English. So those are fascinating plays. This year, we were also scheduled to do a really brilliant Arthur Miller play that I think a lot of people had forgotten existed, called Incident at Vichy. There were some movies of it, but people had forgotten it was a play because it had a cast of 25, and no one can do that anymore. And certainly with COVID, no one can put all those people in a dressing room. So so that's a sort of forgotten play that we had to figure out a way into, a way to tackle it that could work in the modern theater, because a lot of the great plays of the golden age of Jewish playwriting in the 50s and 60s, the work of Sylvia Regan, who was a best friend of Clifford Odets. These plays are just unmanageably large, which is the great challenge.
You bring up so many fascinating issues with this. I mean, one, the tragic loss of Yiddish culture in general, in the American Jewish community, and in this very interesting phenomenon of this desperate desire to assimilate as Americans throughout 20th century American history. There's a tremendous loss in that. And another thing that I just wanted to stay on for a minute, and it's germane to the wider topic, is that the essential changing nature of Jewish identity in our time. Because I certainly remember growing up, with my Yiddish-speaking grandparents, who grew up in the same milieu as Arthur Miller, and in that era, absolutely taking for granted that there is a Jewish face, that there is a way of looking Jewish, and that to be Jewish implies a whole litany of ethnic qualities, language, culture, physiognomy, etc., which is now really problematic.
Absolutely problematic.
How we approach Jewish identity, as we, and I've been doing a lot of teaching, Adam, about the way in which we've wholesale adopted whiteness within the American Jewish narrative, erasing Jews of color, erasing people who have different kinds of experiences. And now we're at an inflection point where we can grapple with that. And I'm wondering, you're bringing it up, but just if you can speak a little more about the potential of Jewish theater to be a medium for grappling with this inflection point in history.
Yeah, it's so critical. And yet it's also a challenge. We are not, I went to Israel recently, and I was meeting with playwrights and directors and producers, and I met with probably 25 people. And at every meeting I said, and so there must be some great Israeli plays about the Ethiopian Jews. Mm-hmm. Crickets across the board. No one could name one. I said, well, are there any Ethiopian Jewish playwrights? No one could name one. Now that may be a reflection of who I was meeting with, that there are these playwrights. But there's a constant challenge for the theater of how we continue to communicate that Judaism is multicultural. It was only, I think, 3 years ago, I produced Nilo Cruz's Sotto Voce, the first play by a Latino playwright ever done in Theater J's then 27-year history, right? Astonishing that it had taken 27 years, and he wrote a play about Cuban Jews and the St. Louis. I mean, it's a completely relevant story. to every part of the Jewish experience. So yes, we have an absolutely critical role to play in this. It's around issues of helping break down the idea of the assumption of whiteness of Judaism, but it's also around ideas of, you know, when I did a play called Trafe, which one of our members' children was in, here in this room, Patty Herman's son Tyler was in it. The play is about a group of Chabad Lubavitchers, essentially a pair of friends, best friends, in their mitzvah tank, and it's a road trip buddy comedy. And when I would share that script with people, there would be some group of people who would push it away, who would go, "Oh, that's the wrong kind of Jewish for us." Right? Like, we don't do the Orthodox Jewish stories. We don't tell the stories of the Chabad Lubavitchers, right? An attitude that I actually think has changed because of Shtisel and Unorthodox. Like, I think this is becoming more comfortable. But our job as a Jewish theater is to try to break out of that, try to say, where are the plays of the crypto Jews of Mexico? Where are the plays that imagine worlds that are not, you know, in Ashka normativity in every way that one can take that? Where are plays that represent Jews of color, that are by Jews of color? And where can we take plays like the Jewish Queen Lear, this Yiddish play, and just by quiet choices, help tell that story? So in that production, we cast multiculturally. We had, you know, Mirola Efros, the businesswoman's business partner, was an African-American man. Her housekeeper and sort of best friend was an Asian woman. Her cantor was an African-American woman. So that we tried to break it up as much as we possibly could in a world where Judaism was assumed and not commented on because everyone was Jewish.
So what happens when you do that? What happens when you know, the proverbial character who's looking at his or her Jewish face in the mirror, and that actor is a person of color? You know, what's the result of that?
Yeah, so two things happen. I mean, first of all, you know, in our field of theater, in the 70s and 80s, there was this idea that we should be doing colorblind casting, right? In Shakespeare, things like that. And people were casting Shakespeare multiculturally, and they have been for years, multiracially, and they have been for years. And nowadays, there's a more informed understanding of this. Like, you can't cast colorblind because audiences aren't colorblind. So it's impossible for us to see color blindly. So instead, you must cast color consciously. And a great example in the Jewish Queen Lear is going, well, I can't just have her housekeeper be a person of color. That's going to tell one story. It has to be her business partner too, right? You have to tell these stories. But I'll also tell you, there is work to be done. I think Theater J has one of the most progressive audiences in the city. And I got consistent complaints about, not overtly racist, but just sort of like, well, I didn't think these three actors were as good as the other ones. I didn't think they felt as authentic to me. They didn't feel right. And these are absolutely racist comments, right? These are comments of people who are refusing to see Judaism on a non-white face. Of course, the white actors, for the most part, weren't Jewish either, right? No one in the cast was Jewish, right? No one on that stage had any authenticity, had any you know, childhood training in Hebrew that was spoken, or the Yiddish that was used in the play. We taught it all to all of them, but they felt that it was more inauthentic, very specifically in those three characters. And I find that deeply problematic. And I'm not sure what the solution for us as a theater is. I mean, continuing to do the work is part of it, continuing to put those faces on stage and to say this can be Jewish too. But how we break down that barrier that people, I do believe unconsciously in the moment, are just saying, I just didn't buy him as much. It's not about his race, but I didn't buy him as much. But when you look at the aggregate, it's always about the characters who are played by artists of color. And that's really tricky.
Yeah, you know, I share that experience with you from my parallel universe in the synagogue world, which we've talked about before. There are surprising lots of parallels between running a shul and running a theater.
A lot.
And you know, I've been talking a lot about the need for Jews to confront their own racism. And I've been talking a lot about how we look at ourselves, how we, and I have gotten pushback. I've gotten pushback from individuals on a whole host of levels. Some of them expected, some of them surprising. That either lays bare their own implicit bias at least, or their outright racism at worst. Or it might be, you know, a sense of otherness that they have internalized because of their Jewishness, which they conflate with paradigms of power and privilege, that when they hear it coming from something like a rabbi in a synagogue, is uniquely challenging for them. And I'm sure that the same kind of dimension exists in theater, if not even, as we say, kal v'chomer, all the more so. When people are confronted with expectation and then have that expectation defied. And I'm just curious, I mean, you know, there's a lot that's being said in the news right now, and it's been how many 20-something days of protests across the world after George Floyd's murder and subsequent atrocities that have happened, you know, that everything's got to change now. And that this is, and your corporations are changing. I just read in the paper, there's not going to be Aunt Jemima anymore. You know, these are all wonderful things. You know, and yeah, and in my perspective, I'm saying, well, synagogues got to change. We have to start not assuming that Jews are white, for example, in a typical suburban American synagogue setting. So what's got to change in, let's say, in theater in general, and what's got to change in Jewish theater now?
This is fantastic questions. And it's important to remember that in that similarity between theater and shul, of which there is a huge amount, one of the core differences is that theater can only speak obliquely, right? We never get to stand up and say, this is what God says, or this is what you should do, or this is what a good person does.
Yeah, I get into trouble a lot because I say, well, this is what God says.
Well, right, yeah, you can get into trouble for it, but you know, theater tends to, and certainly in my leadership of a theater, we try to do it all through the art. And the art is much less direct. And so that's an interesting and really challenging point. So, okay, so the American theater is going through a massive and wonderful turmoil right now as a result of these 20 days. And it's been extraordinary to watch. It coincided with a national theater conference. That national theater conference was, which was online, of course, was essentially, everything that was planned was thrown out. Black voices were centered, and the conversations, you know, the power of the conversations was about how so many theaters have actually used incremental evolutionary change. And in my 15-year professional career, I have seen that change happening in theaters, and I've seen that happening in who gets hired and who is represented behind the table and on the stage, but that the incremental nature of that and the evolutionary nature of that is in and of itself a way of saying, but let's not attack the fundamentals of this institution. Let's not break down the foundation, and certainly let's not take my job, because look, I'm making an incremental change. And so the result is that the artistic directors who lead and managing directors who lead theaters around this country are massively overrepresented by white faces. The artists who actually work on Broadway, except as performers, are overwhelmingly white. And those are the two places that people are actually making livings in this industry. So this is deeply, deeply problematic. And I think it's going to be, it is being examined in a really fundamental way, with artistic directors really grappling with what are their roles in truly changing the makeup of their boards, truly changing the makeup of their staffs, and truly bringing people into positions so that when those artistic directors leave, we are in a place to have a much more diverse field of leaders, particularly. I think that's where a lot of the focus is right now.
I think I just want to lift up something you said and because I just think it's so important, that it has to do with who's sitting on the board and who are the donors and the supporters of the industry. And if they're not reflecting the actual diversity that is out there in our community and in the world, then the theater is going to be hampered by that as well. You know, we see that in a whole host, in all kind of diversity issues. I'm working with that issue in the Jewish community and the LGBT representation on boards as well. You know, all of these issues are critical. And thank you for saying that, because, you know, if we want to see all of these changes, we have to affect that change on all levels.
Yeah, and it's you know, and there's conversations happening at the theater level of, is the model of our boards completely wrong, right? In general, in theater and most not-for-profits, and I don't actually know about synagogues, the board is hefty donors, or people who can bring that, right? Who come from a foundation or a corporation that can solicit a gift from, or they themselves are significant donors. And that is a problematic view if that is your governance. So that's really an interesting challenge and problem. All of it is even more interesting and weird for a Jewish theater. And it's certainly something we're beginning conversations about. Patty Herman, who's in this on this call, is the co-chair of our council, which is our equivalent of a board, and we're having a conversation about this very topic this week.
Right.
But how to start to break, and we have I will say, a completely white council right now, and predominantly Jewish, not completely Jewish. And it is absolutely like it's a donor council, right? It's people who support the theater and are ambassadors for us and are connected. So the questions of how to start to make change are really tricky. We don't want to have tokenism. We want to actually tap into people who want to be on our board, who want to be involved, who are there for good reasons. And also we have to acknowledge that we are a culturally specific theater, and that there's we can't stop doing Jewish as we work to help our community grow, and as we work to do our own work around anti-racism that we want to be putting forward, and the anti-Blackness that we want to be removing in the community around us. So that's very, very tricky. You know, ironically, I don't like to do public declarations of things from artists. I think that's I find it disingenuous. But I had sort of made a quiet internal vow a little while ago that we just had to try to find more authentic ways to have work by artists of color on our stage. And so this year we were going to do a play, we hopefully still are, I think we should be fine, it's in the spring, called Fires in the Mirror, which couldn't be more timely. It's about the Crown Heights riots, and it's based on interviews in the Black community and the Jewish community. And it's by Anna Devere Smith, one-person play about the tensions 30 years ago in 1991, August, that erupted into the Crown Heights riots. And that was sort of, you know, that we have done work by artists of color that dealt with the Jewish experience. Certainly, Theater J has a wonderful history of it. This was my real sort of commitment to say, no, absolutely every year we must be doing this, because otherwise we're not going to move change forward fast enough. And that's the next step of that is going to be how to cause those pieces of art to be created. Because at the end of the day, currently, there isn't that much quality art plays written about the Jewish experience by artists of color in a way that I think deals authentically with the experience of being, or what I gather to be authentically with the experience of being a person of color. So that's now the next challenge, is to say, do we need to be commissioning this work? Do we need to be, you know, creating prizes for this work so it gets submitted to us? Do we need to be changing our submission policy, which normally doesn't let people just send in work, and saying, no, for, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color artists, you're allowed to just send us work without an agent to get in the door. And I don't have all the answers to this yet, because it would, in some ways, it feels like it would be much easier to be roundhouse theater right now, and to be saying, I can do plays about anything. So great, yeah, I'll do the African schoolgirls play. You know, I'll do this, I'll do that. That is an easier step than to do it within a Jewish context, which I'm super excited about, because the challenge is interesting.
Incredible. By the way, we're gonna allow people to write questions in the chat, by the way. So if you have questions, this is a good time to put them down. I just wanted to reflect that it is a fraught thing. Anything Jewish is fraught, but it is a very fraught thing in theater, and in Jewish theater in particular, I would imagine that, there is this wonderful, deep drive to social justice in Jewish identity and in Jewish history and in Jewish experience. But there's a danger in that too, because you're an artistic institution. And that, I think this is just my opinion, one of the real blessings that you've brought, Adam, to Theater J is the ability to celebrate a wide range of beautiful Jewish expressions of theater, without it getting pigeonholed into it's had struggles along those lines in the past. And you've been able to strike that balance. And I can only imagine that is a very difficult challenge in these deeply politicized and polarized times that we're now experiencing. And so I guess, the question is, how do you maintain this sort of these three polarity, these three places, right? It's the artistic, the Jewish, and the heart of tzedek, of righteousness and justice that is present in the Jewish experience. And how do you do that? And I don't know if you have another answer for that, but
I do. I have two answers for that. So I have one that's on stage and one that's off stage. So I'll do off stage first. Off stage, a huge part of that is trying to figure out what running an ethical company is, which to me it means what it should be when you run a Jewish theater company, that it's not just about the work on stage, but about how you do the work. And for us, that's meant everything from taking a very serious look at our compensation of artists in this country. The greatest subsidizer of the arts is artists working below a living wage. They contribute far more than any donors contribute to the arts. So we have dramatically changed what our compensation levels are, and we've also made our compensation levels entirely equitable. They used to be negotiated, which meant there was all sorts of opportunities for people to get paid more based on all sorts of reasons that fundamentally were not fair. So our artists know what their compensation is. They know what everyone else's compensation is. We're upfront and clear about that, and it is significantly raised. We've created a caregiver resource program where we are really carefully thinking about what it means to be an artist who is an actor, let's say, who has children, who has to come to evening performances, weekend rehearsals, all of these things, and what are the ways in which we're supporting them. And we have some great advantages, like being an institution that also has a childcare center. So there are real things that we can offer, but realizing that in every way trying to operate theater ethically is part of this work and is part of being a Jewish theater, and I think a vital part of being a Jewish theater. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is, I think, really the question you were getting at. Look, I have a theory that it's very easy for art to become surrounded by a dialogue that is so strident and didactic that it skews the understanding of the art. In other words, I think it's very easy to do a play and to have the dialogue about it be so heated that what ends up happening is only the people who already agree with the kind of message of the play they're the only ones who come, and they get to pat themselves on the back, and the people who disagree don't come. Maybe they stand outside protesting, or maybe they don't come at all, or they don't even know about it. And what have you done to change the world? And so there's a number of ways in which we've tried to navigate this. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. It's a play that we were due to do this. We were to be performing it right now. In fact, there was going to be a noon matinee of it today, called Compulsion, or The House Behind. And Compulsion, or The House Behind, is a play about Meyer Levin, a writer, who, among other things, really fought for the Dyer Van Frank to be published in America. and fought for it to be turned into a play. He always thought it needed to be a play. And he ended up getting into a huge battle with Otto Frank about, is the story of Diary of Anne Frank a Jewish story or is it a universal story? And as you may know, in the original American printing of it, Eleanor Roosevelt, of all people, wrote the introduction, right? Talking about it as a universal story. I mean, to talk about a choice of a universal person, right? And Meyer Levin had wanted to write it. So he gets into this feud with Otto Frank, huge battle. He ends up, they end up in lawsuits. And then he moves to Israel, Meyer Levin. And Act 2 of the play takes place in Israel, where he's trying to sort of mount a production of his version of Diary of Anne Frank, and dealing with all the issues of Israel in the 1960s and 70s. And the play's sneaky, and I can talk about this now because we're not doing it. The play is about, is Anne Frank Jewish or universal? And then Act 2 is set in Israel. And of course, it gets to the question of, is Israel a Jewish state or a universal place of, you know, a country for anyone to live in? And it absolutely intentionally is dealing with this question. I mean, there's no question in my mind that this is what the play is meant to make you think about. But it's super sneaky because the play never comes out and says that it's about Israel. It's about Anne Frank. You know, it's all metaphor. It's all sleight of hand. And that, to me, is the kind of play that excites me the most.
Totally.
That engage with social issues, but welcome everyone in. There's no clear politics of this play. It makes you think and engage. Another example of a play I'm dying to do at some point, it's from Israel. It's a play called God Waits at the Station. And it's a play about a suicide bombing. And it's written in a documentary style. And the people interviewed, it's not truly a documentary, but the characters you meet are, you know, the woman who conducted the bombing, who strapped on the bomb to herself, the Israeli guard who decided to make an exception and let her in, her brother and her parents, the various different people who were at the cafe. And as you're reading the play, you're realizing that you're empathizing with a different character every 2 seconds and sort of understanding their story. And it's the kind of play that I think you can't help but grow from as a human, from watching, learn something. If you wanted to try to describe the exact politics of that play, I think anyone would have a different description based on what their own politics would be. It doesn't ever tell you what it's trying to do in the world. It just does the art. And so I've tried to embrace that mindset of just do the art and let the art work in its sneaky, sneaky ways, to deepen our sense of empathy, because I think theater is extraordinary at that, to help us understand a world that is outside of our own, a wider world than our own. And I think theater is perfect for that. And all of these things, I think, can be part of social change, but they avoid putting the artistic director, certainly, and the theater also, in a place of saying, this is the statement this play is making, and this is why we believe that statement. It lets you as an audience member decide what to receive.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful. And what a beautiful explication of how it is art and how effective art functions on the level of bringing you right into the middle of the experience and allowing you to draw your conclusions. And how much more sophisticated that is than hitting you over the head by turning it into a soapbox. And I agree. And frankly, again, to talk about parallels with synagogues, that's really, you know, ritual is an art form as well. Ritual is a form of a play, if you will, where there are actors, there are roles, there are lines. And when it's done right, it also ushers you into that experience in a way much more effectively than a rabbi standing and saying, this is what God wants you to say and think and do. So as a fellow traveler in a parallel field, I deeply appreciate what you are doing with Theater J. Couple of looks like questions, comments here in that I'll take a look at here now. Nika and Samantha say, as a Black actress at a majority white conservatory studying acting, I reinforce the importance of people of color administration members.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Samantha, yeah. Yeah.
It's historically been such a disparity in our field. And the challenge is that our field can look to an audience's eyes like it is representative of America because the people on stage are.
Mhm.
But if the people creating the theater aren't, I mean, for years and years and years, it was very rare for a Black director to direct a Black play in America. That is changing, not changed, changing.
Mhm.
The interesting thing, however, about this, just to go off on this for 2 seconds, is our culture right now, American culture, is sort of at war with itself over two competing ideals that we care deeply about. One is authenticity,
Mm.
right? And in theater, that means we care deeply about, not having yellow face on stage in a production of Madame Butterfly, let's say, right? And making sure that an August Wilson play is directed by an African-American director, right? That's authenticity. And the other competing ideal is inclusivity. So right now we're also saying it is vital to make sure that people who haven't had a seat at the table get a seat at the table. And what's difficult is those two things bash against each other in all sorts of really interesting ways. And I think Jewish theater is where they bash against each other the most. So there was recently a production of Diary of Anne Frank done by People's Light and Theater Company in Malvern, Pennsylvania. And they cast, they called me before they did it. They wanted my opinion. I was like, I don't care what you do with your theater, that's your problem. But they called me and they said, we want to cast Diary of Anne Frank multiculturally, multiracially. What do you think? And I said, cool, interesting, go for it, have fun. I don't know, I'm not in charge. And they did it. And in fact, they cast a few actors who are Jews of color. So you've got, not all, but some. So you've got a company of some Jews, some non-Jews, some white, some not white. And one of the reviewers said, I'm not going to review this production. And she wrote an article about it in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And she said, I'm not going to review this production because it's taking the story of the Holocaust away from Jews. And that is a deeply anti-Semitic act. That's the argument she made. She made it much better than that. But that was the basic premise of it. A very complicated argument to make because the big lie beneath it all is that any other production of Diary of Anne Frank would have been performed by Jews.
Right.
No, it would have been performed by Italians, just like every other production of Diary of Anne Frank is done, right? I mean, it's like the convention of Jewish theater is to do, dark-haired people, they're Jewish, great, fine. Yeah, they can pass as Jews.
Right.
So this play is, I think, a great example of this thing bashing against each other. And the challenge is that there's no argument to make for Jews and inclusivity in the American theater, because historically we've always had a seat at the table in the American theater. It's one of the places we've had a seat. So there's no argument to make there. But yet we're constantly in a position of saying, who can tell this story? And I'm seeing the field get more and more nervous. I'm seeing actors come to auditions and disclose to me that they are not Jewish, which is very strange. And I've had directors of color who I've tried to hire say, I don't feel like this is my story to tell of this Jewish play. This is outside of my world. So this is that authenticity argument taking over at this moment. Does this, I don't know, does this inclusivity, authenticity thing work within a synagogue context? Do you feel this as well?
Oh my God, totally. I mean, look, that it takes on many different forms, but there is a constant struggle between what is authentically Jewish or traditional Jewish versus what's inclusive of our lived experience, and so it plays out in those dimensions. But I think what you're naming here is this increasing complexity of what it means to be Jewish in our time, and it's both about us, but it's also about how our society sees us. It's about us occupying positions of power and privilege in certain ways in American society that have been unknown to us as a people prior to our American experience, and our confusion at grappling with that now, given this other dimension of racism and who is a Jew of color and who is white and who is, and how does that impact all of these things, and also issues of victimization of the Holocaust, and also who gets to claim victimization more, and a lot of anxiety around that in the Jewish community and in the non-Jewish community, as you're saying, for those who want to steer clear. Incredibly rich, fertile ground for artistry and for artists and for theater and for all of, and nobody can address these issues better than theater can. And just so grateful for you. I want to read a couple of our comments here, and then we're going to wrap up. I have a comment here from Nancy: fascinating social construct that we seem to have grown complacent with. How have other ethnic groups managed these issues? Ethnic theater groups. Interesting.
Yeah, would you want me to respond to that one?
Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. It used to be that we talked about culturally specific theaters. And the idea of culturally specific theaters was theaters like Theater J, Deaf West, which is a deaf theater company in California, the Irish Rep, Penumbra Theater, which is an African-American theater, Crossroads Theater, which is an African-American theater. And many of what are now calling themselves the theaters of color, which is a more defined group, have pointed out that the phrase culturally specific theater is wildly problematic. They would argue that all theater is culturally specific, it just happens to be culturally specifically white. And that to pretend that Arena Stage is not a culturally specific theater is an incredibly problematic phrase. So the result is that the theaters of color have started defining themselves as that. And at national theater conferences, there's now space for theaters of color specifically, which means that like the Irish theater, Jewish theater, and the deaf theater are all like, who are we, what do we do? So that's an interesting problem. The interesting thing that the theaters of color are now arguing, which is a really powerful and complicated argument, is of theft of resources. And they are making the argument that they are disproportionately underfunded compared to white theaters, majority white theaters, they I think is what their phrase is that's being used right now. And that there's a true theft of resources, that the great actors are getting taken to perform at the Goodman, at Arena, at the major mainstream white theaters, that the donors are being brought from their specific communities and brought onto the boards of these larger institutions. And that even in fighting for the rights to individual plays, they are losing those battles to mainstream theaters that are now seeking to diversify themselves in some way, but also continuing to be fundamentally racist places to work, or at least problematic places for artists of color to work. So this is the debate that's happening right now in the field, and it's I think it's quite explosive right now. Yeah.
Wow. So on so many dimensions here, it is it's interesting to figure out where we fit in with that.
Yeah.
So we're wrapping up now, Adam. I guess one of the things that's on all of our minds, everyone wants to know when synagogues are going to be opening up. How are you guys thinking about this next season? What I see you're doing programs like the one right here, and that's wonderful. Talk to us about the immediate future at Theater J, so we can have a sense.
So we didn't see a way in which we could produce safely for our audience or our artists through the remainder of 2020. And theater has a long runway, so it takes about 6 months to put a show up, and you start investing in the show pretty heavily at the beginning of that, and you continue throughout. So we had to make a decision now, early, to really get a sense of what we thought was realistic. And as a result, we've canceled 3 productions this fall. Sadly, 3 productions I was very excited about, including our all drag a cappella performance, Electile Dysfunction, which we were going to do right before the election, which is, just feels like what a missed opportunity. That's going to be hard to reschedule that one. So that's what we did, and we replaced it with a series of things. We offer classes for theater lovers, and we're offering some classes taught by some of DC's top talent, Aaron Posner, Holly Twyford, the actress, Nefeli, and Doni Addis, the set designer and costume designer, whose work you've probably seen all around town. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're offering readings of our Yiddish theater plays, and what we're finding is that we're reaching a much, much larger audience. We've had a 1,300% increase in attendance in our classes. Our Yiddish theater plays are reaching, 4 times as many people as they would reach, and they're reaching people all around the world. And so that's very cool.
So exciting.
The hope is to come back in the spring and to have our spring programming intact. Obviously, we continue to read the same newspapers as the rest of you. The challenges are not just how to make sure our audience can be safe, but also how to make sure our artists can be safe and our staff can be safe. And, theater is, as the head of the Actors Union reminds us, the only profession where at work you can be required, not just asked, but required to kiss your colleagues. There's unique challenges of sharing dressing rooms, getting changed, touching the same props, making out, stage combat that just don't apply in other fields. So we're waiting to learn more from the union. We're in some conversation with some of the physicians who work with us to try to understand what we might be able to propose. And of course, we're trying to understand a business model that can make it all work, because 6 foot social distancing 6 feet is pretty darn far apart in a theater. We found we could fit in our 236 seat theater around 44 people with social distancing. So that math just doesn't make sense for us until we can figure out a better way, whether it's a combination of performance and streaming, or some other things that can allow us to perform in an economically viable way.
Well, it sounds like you are making use of these difficult times in truly wonderful, extraordinary ways. Theater J is a great blessing, not only in the region, but nationally, for the kind of work that it's doing. And you're a blessing, Adam, for all the ways in which you are bringing us
Thank you, Rabbi.
to all of these issues, and I should also it creates community, because theater is a form of community, and in an incredibly powerful way. Kol hakavod to you, and I want to thank everybody for being here today, and for learning together from Adam. And God willing, please God, that next spring, may we all have our vaccine or whatever it is that allows us to be in community together again, and to experience all that you guys have to offer. So all the best.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody. Thanks again, everybody. Yes. Big applause for you. Take care. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.